In the heart of Montana's wilderness, a wounded bear is discovered clinging to life. But she's not alone. What she's protecting leaves everyone stunned. Why would a grizzly, an apex predator, defy nature itself? What hidden bond is so powerful that it transcends instinct and survival? As experts race to unravel the mystery, one thing becomes clear. This is no ordinary rescue. This is a story that will change everything. The wind howled through the Montana wilderness, weaving between towering pines and stirring up drifts of snow across the forest floor. A radio crackled inside the ranger station, its static breaking the silence before Jake Bennett's voice cut through. "Emma, you there? We've got a report from a hiker, an injured bear, about 2 miles off Ridge Trail." Emma Collins, biologist and wildlife specialist, tightened her grip on the radio. "Injured?" she repeated, already reaching for her gear. "How bad?" "Not sure. Hiker said it was limping, possibly hit by a stray bullet. But here's the weird part. She said the bear wasn't alone." Emma's brow furrowed. "Cubs?" "No." There was a hesitation before Jake's voice returned. "She said the bear was guarding something, a hollow log." Emma exchanged a glance with Mark Reynolds, the veterinarian who had been reviewing notes on a recent elk migration. He raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt as she grabbed her coat. "I'm on my way. Meet you at the trailhead in 10. Within minutes, Emma was racing down the snow-packed road in her truck, its headlights cutting through the early evening haze. The cold was biting, the kind of winter chill that settled into bones and stayed there. But Emma was too preoccupied to care. An injured bear was concerning, but the detail about the hollow log nagged at her. If there were no cubs, then what could possibly make a wounded grizzly linger? She arrived at the base of Ridge Trail, where Jake's truck was already parked. He was adjusting his pack when she stepped out. "Hiker's gone," he told her, nodding toward the empty trailhead. Didn't want to stick around, but she left detailed coordinates. Emma adjusted her gloves. "Let's go." They moved swiftly, following the winding path up the ridge, their boots crunching over frost-hardened earth. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees, but Emma's mind was fixed on what lay ahead. When they reached the coordinates, Jake pointed to a patch of disturbed snow. "Tracks lead this way." They followed the prints, noting the signs of struggle, a deep impression where something large had stumbled, a smear of blood darkening the snow. The air was heavy with the crisp scent of pine and something earthier, muskier. Then just ahead, partially obscured by a fallen tree, Emma saw it. Luna. The bear lay curled around a hollow log, her massive body forming a protective arc. Even from a distance, Emma could see the pain in her posture, the way she favored one side, the stiffness of her breathing. But more than that, she saw the unmistakable ferocity in Luna's eyes as they met hers. Jake exhaled slowly. "She's not moving away." Emma nodded. Most wounded animals, especially bears, would retreat at the sight of humans. But Luna wasn't leaving. She was guarding. Carefully, Emma edged closer, her voice low and steady. "Hey there, girl. We're not here to hurt you." Luna huffed but didn't charge, her deep brown eyes locked onto Emma's movements. Emma took another step and peered into the hollow log. Her breath hitched. Inside, nestled against the rough bark, were 2 tiny figures, a Labrador puppy, black as midnight, and a tiny shivering kitten with gray and white fur. They were curled together, their small bodies pressed close for warmth, and they weren't just hiding there, they were being protected. Emma glanced at Jake, whose expression mirrored her shock. "Are you seeing this?" she murmured. Jake gave a slow nod. "A grizzly guarding a dog and a cat?" It was unheard of. Grizzlies were apex predators, their instincts honed for survival, not nurturing creatures they would normally see as prey. Yet here was Luna, battered and wounded, shielding 2 fragile lives with the full weight of her body. Emma crouched lower, her heart pounding. The puppy lifted its head first, its dark eyes sleepy and trusting. The kitten barely stirred, too exhausted to react. They had likely been out here for days, surviving against all odds under Luna's protection. "We have to get them out," Jake whispered, his voice tinged with awe. Emma nodded, but knew it wouldn't be that simple. Luna wasn't just some injured bear. They were dealing with a mothering instinct that had overridden her own survival needs. They couldn't simply walk in and take the animals without risking Luna's wrath. She reached for her pack, slowly retrieving a piece of cloth soaked in a mild sedative spray. "We calm her first," she said softly. "Then we get all three of them out." Jake hesitated. "You sure about this?" Emma met his gaze. "We can't leave them." Jake didn't argue. They worked quickly, setting up the tranquilizer dart while Emma continued speaking in a low, soothing tone. Luna's ears flicked, her breathing heavy, but she didn't attack. Instead, she watched them, as if weighing their intentions. When the dart struck her shoulder, she flinched but didn't roar. Instead, she exhaled a slow, heavy breath, her massive body sinking further into the snow. Her eyelids drooped, and within minutes, she slumped, unconscious but breathing steadily. Emma wasted no time. She and Jake rushed forward, carefully extracting the puppy and kitten from the log. The puppy gave a weak whimper, but made no attempt to resist. The kitten let out a barely audible mew before nuzzling into Emma's gloved hands. Jake checked Luna's injuries. "She's got a bullet wound, old but deep. Someone tried to take her down." Emma's jaw clenched. "Poachers!" They worked efficiently, wrapping Luna in a secure tarp for transport and ensuring the smaller animals were tucked safely in Emma's coat for warmth. As they lifted Luna onto a sled, Emma glanced down at the two fragile creatures in her arms. Charlie. The name came unbidden as she looked at the puppy, and Willow for the tiny, trembling kitten. Jake noticed her expression. "Already naming them?" Emma smiled faintly. "They deserve it." As they began the trek back, Emma's thoughts swirled. What had led Luna to take them in? What had kept her, an apex predator, from doing what instinct dictated? She didn't have the answers yet, but as she glanced down at the small, trusting faces pressed against her chest, she knew one thing. This was only the beginning. The transport vehicle rumbled down the winding road, its headlights slicing through the darkened forest as Emma Collins kept a watchful eye on the back seat. Luna lay motionless, her powerful body rising and falling with each slow breath, the sedative still holding her in its gentle grip. Beside her, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, were Charlie and Willow, nestled together for warmth. The puppy's small chest fluttered with each breath, while the kitten, though frail, had curled tightly against him, seeking comfort in his warmth. Emma's hands tightened around the wheel as she navigated the bumpy road toward the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, her mind still spinning from what she had just witnessed, a grizzly bear protecting a puppy and a kitten. It defied every natural law she had studied. She had seen mother bears fiercely guard their cubs, had witnessed them risk their lives to fight off threats, but never had she seen a predator act as a guardian to species so different from its own. The scientific part of her brain scrambled for explanations. Perhaps Luna's maternal instincts had been triggered by the vulnerability of the smaller animals. Or maybe it was some kind of trauma response. But deep down, she knew there was something more to it, something that logic alone could not explain. Jake, sitting in the passenger seat, shook his head in quiet amazement. "You ever seen anything like this before?" "Not even close," Emma admitted, glancing at him briefly before refocusing on the road. "If someone had told me this story, I wouldn't have believed it." Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "People always underestimate animals. We think we've got them all figured out, but then something like this happens and it just..." He gestured vaguely, struggling for words. "It just changes everything." Emma nodded. The glow of the rehabilitation center came into view up ahead, its small cluster of buildings barely visible against the thick woods. The facility was modest but well-equipped, run by a team of dedicated veterinarians, conservationists, and volunteers who worked tirelessly to care for injured wildlife. Tonight, they would be adding 3 unexpected residents to their list. As they pulled into the main driveway, the doors to the clinic swung open, and Dr. Mark Reynolds stepped out, already shrugging into his medical gloves. His expression was one of practiced calm, but his eyes flicked from Luna to the small bundle in Emma's arms with barely concealed curiosity. "I was expecting an injured bear," he said, "but it looks like you brought a little extra." Emma carefully climbed out of the vehicle, cradling Charlie and Willow against her chest. "It's a long story," she said, "but first let's make sure they're all okay." Mark nodded and gestured for them to follow him inside. The clinic was warm, filled with the antiseptic scent of disinfectant mixed with the earthy smell of hay and animal bedding. As Jake and Mark worked together to lift Luna onto the exam table, Emma settled into a chair near the corner, gently unwrapping the blanket to get a better look at Charlie and Willow. Charlie blinked up at her with sleepy eyes, his tiny paws stretching outward before he let out a soft sigh and nuzzled against her arm. Willow, more delicate, let out a faint mewl before shifting closer to the warmth of the puppy's fur. Emma's heart squeezed at the sight. They had been through so much, yet even in their exhaustion, they clung to each other as though nothing in the world could separate them. "Vitals are weak but stable," Mark said, adjusting the overhead lamp as he examined Luna's wound. "She's lucky. The bullet missed any major organs, but there's an infection setting in. We'll have to clean it out, remove the fragment, and get her started on antibiotics." Emma nodded. "And the smaller ones?" Mark turned his attention to the two tiny creatures in her arms, his brow furrowing as he ran a gentle hand over Charlie's ribs. "Malnourished, but nothing critical. He needs food, warmth, and rest. The kitten," he hesitated, inspecting Willow's frail body. "She's weaker, possibly hypothermic. We'll have to monitor her closely." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. She had seen animals survive impossible odds before, but the thought of losing Willow now, after everything, was unbearable. "Do whatever you have to," she said softly. Mark gave a reassuring nod before motioning to one of the veterinary assistants. "Let's get some warm fluids into the kitten and prep the surgical room for Luna." The next few hours passed in a blur of movement. Emma and Jake assisted where they could, but for the most part, all they could do was wait. Charlie, after eating a small meal, had curled up in a nest of blankets, his tiny body finally able to relax. Willow had been placed in an incubator for warmth, her frail form wrapped snugly in soft towels. And Luna was fighting. Emma paced the length of the waiting area, her mind restless. The clinic had quieted, the hum of machinery and the occasional murmur of voices, the only sounds breaking the silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. She thought of Luna lying out there in the cold, battered and bleeding, yet refusing to leave her unlikely companions behind. Finally, the door to the operating room swung open, and Mark stepped out, removing his gloves. His expression was tired but relieved. "She made it through," he announced. Emma exhaled, the weight of her worry easing slightly. "And the others?" "The puppy is responding well," Mark said. "The kitten is still touch and go, but she's a fighter." Jake let out a low whistle. "Damn, they're all survivors." Emma walked over to the observation window, where Luna lay sedated in a large padded enclosure. Even in sleep, she seemed protective, her massive paws positioned as if to shield something. Emma turned her gaze to the smaller crates beside her, where Charlie and Willow rested. Despite the separation, there was an undeniable connection between them all, an invisible thread that tied them together in a way no one could quite explain. Mark crossed his arms, studying the scene through the glass. "We've seen a lot of strange things in this job," he said, "but this is something else." Emma nodded. "It's more than instinct, more than survival." Jake leaned against the wall, his expression contemplative. "Maybe it's just what the world needs right now, a reminder that love doesn't always make sense." Emma looked at Luna, at Charlie and Willow, at the fragile, beautiful bond they had formed against all odds. She didn't know what the future held for them, whether Luna could ever return to the wild, whether Charlie and Willow would find homes of their own. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. Some connections couldn't be explained. They just were. The soft hum of the clinic's heating system filled the air as Emma sat beside the observation window, watching Luna stir for the first time since surgery. The grizzly's massive body shuddered slightly as the effects of the sedative wore off, her breath uneven, her movements slow. Despite the pain she must have been feeling, her first instinct was to lift her head and scan her surroundings. Her dark eyes, still clouded with exhaustion, searched for something. No, for someone. Emma felt a lump rise in her throat as she followed Luna's gaze to the crate where Charlie and Willow lay curled together. Even in her vulnerable state, Luna was looking for them, protecting them, the same way she had in the forest. Emma pressed a hand against the glass, as if she could somehow reassure the bear through the barrier between them. Jake, who had been standing near the back of the room, let out a low whistle. "I don't care how many times I see it, it still doesn't make sense." He moved closer, arms crossed over his chest. "You think she understands what's happening?" Emma nodded slightly, still transfixed by Luna's quiet but determined attempt to move. She knows she's somewhere new, and she knows they're still here. Mark had entered the room, glancing down at his clipboard as he updated Luna's chart. "Her vitals are stable, but she's not out of the woods yet. The infection was deeper than I thought, and the stress of the surgery is taking a toll." He sighed, setting the clipboard down on the counter. "We'll keep her under observation for at least another week. Maybe 2. Emma barely registered his words. Her mind was still turning over the impossible sight before her. Luna had been through trauma, more than just the bullet wound, more than just being stranded in the wilderness. Something deeper, something unspoken, tied her to those 2 small creatures. What was it? A need to protect? A sense of loss? As if on cue, Charlie let out a soft whimper from inside his crate. Emma turned to see the Labrador puppy stirring, his small body stretching before his tiny paws pressed against the crate door. His dark eyes blinked sleepily as he let out another soft cry, searching for the warmth he had grown accustomed to. Willow, smaller and still weak, barely moved, her tiny frame tucked tightly against the blanket. "Let me take him," Emma said before she even realized what she was doing. She stepped toward the crate, unfastening the latch before lifting Charlie into her arms. His small body trembled slightly before he nuzzled against her chest, his breathing evening out. It was instinct, pure and simple. He had spent days with Luna, and now, separated from her, he was searching for something familiar. Jake arched an eyebrow as he leaned against the counter. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Emma hesitated. "If I put him near her," Mark cut in, rubbing his chin, "it could be dangerous. She's still weak, but she's a wild animal. We don't know how she'll react in this state." Emma looked down at Charlie, then back at Luna, who was still watching them from behind the glass. The tension in her body, the flicker of distress in her dark eyes. It was all too familiar. Emma had seen it before, in rescued animals that had lost something dear to them. The hollow, aching grief of missing something they couldn't quite understand. She took a deep breath. "I'll be careful." Mark exchanged a glance with Jake before nodding reluctantly. "All right, but the second there's any sign of distress, you get him out of there." Emma didn't need to be told twice. Cradling Charlie securely, she stepped into the controlled enclosure where Luna lay. The bear's head lifted slightly, her massive paws twitching as she caught the scent of the puppy. Emma kept her movements slow, deliberate, kneeling a few feet away before gently setting Charlie down on the padded floor. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Charlie's tiny tail gave a hesitant wag before he padded forward, sniffing the air. He let out a small, questioning whimper. Luna inhaled deeply, the tension in her body shifting. Her nose twitched, her massive frame going unnervingly still. Then, with a slowness that felt almost deliberate, she reached out, one enormous paw extending just far enough to brush against Charlie's side. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Charlie, still too young to understand fear, responded the way he always had. He leaned against the warmth of Luna's fur, pressing himself into the space beside her massive shoulder. A low, contented rumble escaped the grizzly's throat, something close to a purr but deeper, more primal. She shifted slightly, adjusting her position just enough to make room for the tiny creature against her side. Jake swore under his breath from behind the glass. "Unbelievable!" Emma could barely move. Every instinct in her screamed that this shouldn't be happening, that it defied every law of nature she had spent her life studying. And yet here it was. Luna wasn't just tolerating Charlie's presence. She was accepting him, pulling him close, protecting him. Charlie let out a sleepy sigh and curled against her, his small body rising and falling in time with her breathing. Emma slowly stood, backing away to give them space, her heart hammering. This was something new, something profound, something that couldn't be explained by simple survival instincts. She turned to Mark, whose expression was one of complete disbelief. "We have to document this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, still staring at the impossible bond unfolding before them. This changes everything. The following days at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center passed in a haze of quiet observation and cautious amazement. Luna's recovery was slow but steady. The bullet wound had been deep, but with the infection clearing and the swelling going down, she had begun moving more comfortably. What no one had expected, however, was the way she seemed to relax most when Charlie was beside her. Every morning, Emma would find the little Labrador curled up in the crook of Luna's massive forearm, his small chest rising and falling in sync with hers. The first few nights, she had been afraid to leave them alone together, worried that some buried instinct in Luna would reawaken and put Charlie in danger. But the opposite happened. If anything, it was as though Luna could not fully rest unless she knew the tiny creature was close. Even Willow, though much weaker, had begun responding to Luna's presence in ways no one could fully explain. She was still too frail to move much on her own, her tiny body recovering from near starvation. But whenever she was placed near Luna's enclosure, her breathing evened out, and her little paws, barely bigger than a coin, would twitch in the air as though reaching for something. The connection was undeniable. Jake leaned against the glass one afternoon, arms crossed as he watched the odd trio. "This isn't just imprinting, is it?" he asked, his voice quiet but thoughtful. Emma, standing beside him, shook her head. "Imprinting happens when a baby sees something as a parent figure. Charlie and Willow weren't newborns when they found her. They were already old enough to recognize that Luna isn't a dog or a cat. And yet, they trust her completely." Jake let out a slow breath, watching as Charlie stirred from his nap, his floppy ears twitching before he stretched against Luna's fur. The massive grizzly let out a low, sleepy rumble, shifting just enough to accommodate the puppy without fully waking. "It's more than trust," Jake murmured. "It's like they belong to each other." Emma didn't respond, but the weight in her chest told her that she agreed. It was a bond that defied logic, yet it was happening right before their eyes. The story of the guardian bear had begun spreading beyond the clinic. What had started as whispers among the staff soon became a viral sensation. A visiting veterinarian had snapped a photo of Luna and Charlie curled up together, and within days the image had exploded across social media, drawing the attention of journalists, conservationists, and everyday people who were captivated by the mystery of it all. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines that ranged from "unlikely friendship," "the bear, the puppy, and the kitten who changed everything," to "science can't explain this. What Luna teaches us about compassion in the wild." Emma wasn't sure how she felt about it. On one hand, the attention brought a wave of donations to the center, funding that would go toward not only Luna's care, but dozens of other rescued animals. On the other, she worried about what it would mean for Luna's future. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had already started fielding calls from research institutions and journalists requesting interviews. "This is unprecedented," he told Emma one evening as they reviewed Luna's medical chart. "If we can understand why this bond formed, we might be able to change the way we think about animal behavior entirely." Emma sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "I get that, Mark, but she's not an experiment. She's a living, breathing creature who's already been through hell. I don't want to turn her into some kind of spectacle." Mark's expression softened. "Neither do I, but you have to admit, this story is bigger than us." Emma knew he was right. She had spent years working in wildlife conservation, studying bear behavior, tracking migrations, and understanding survival instincts, but nothing had prepared her for this. If they could learn something from Luna, something that challenged the way they understood the natural world, wasn't that worth exploring? That question weighed on her as the days passed. Meanwhile, the bond between Luna and her unlikely family only grew stronger. Willow, still recovering, had begun eating on her own, her tiny body growing stronger under careful monitoring. One evening, after another long day, Emma sat by Luna's enclosure, watching the quiet rise and fall of her breathing. Charlie lay curled beside her, his tiny paws twitching as he dreamed, and Willow, still delicate but determined, was nestled between them. The air was thick with something Emma couldn't quite describe. Peace? Love? Some wordless connection that shouldn't have existed but did? She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A knock on the observation glass startled her. Jake stood on the other side, gesturing for her to step out into the hall. She rose reluctantly, casting one last glance at the animals before slipping out to join him. "What's up?" she asked, stretching out her stiff limbs. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. "Just got off the phone with the State Wildlife Commission," he said, voice carefully measured. "They're sending a team to evaluate Luna." Emma's stomach dropped. Evaluate? To determine whether she can be released back into the wild. The words hit like a punch to the gut. She had known this moment would come. Luna was a wild bear after all, and the ultimate goal of any wildlife rescue was to rehabilitate animals and return them to their natural habitat. But the idea of separating her from Charlie and Willow felt wrong. "She's not ready," Emma said quickly, shaking her head. "She's still healing." "Maybe," Jake admitted, "but they'll want to make a decision soon. If she can survive on her own, they're going to push for release." Emma clenched her fists. "And what happens to Charlie and Willow?" Jake hesitated. "They're domestic animals, Emma. They can't go with her." The thought made her chest tighten painfully. How could she explain to the commission what she had seen? That Luna wasn't just tolerating these animals. She was bonded to them. She had protected them when she had no reason to. She had mothered them in a way no one could understand. And now they were going to be ripped apart because it didn't fit the narrative of how things were supposed to work? She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. "We have to fight this." Jake studied her, then nodded. "Then we'd better start making a case." Emma turned back toward the window, watching as Luna shifted in her sleep, curling instinctively around the tiny creatures that had become her family. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to keep them together. Because some bonds weren't just meant to be studied, they were meant to be protected. The first signs of winter's deepening grip settled over the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, frost edging the windows in the morning air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside Luna's enclosure, the massive bear stirred, shifting just enough to pull Charlie and Willow closer against her warm fur. The small Labrador puppy let out a sleepy sigh, his tail twitching, while the tiny kitten stretched her fragile legs, curling her body tighter against the rhythmic rise and fall of Luna's breathing. It was a scene Emma had come to expect, yet no matter how many times she witnessed it, the sight never ceased to amaze her. The bond between them had only strengthened in the weeks since their rescue, and now as she watched from the other side of the glass, she felt a cold knot of worry settle in her chest. The Wildlife Commission was coming today. She had barely slept the night before, turning every possible argument over in her mind, anticipating the inevitable battle she would have to fight. Releasing Luna into the wild was the standard protocol for bears that recovered from injuries. Emma had helped facilitate countless reintroductions over the years. But Luna wasn't just another bear. She had formed a family here, something that defied every rule of nature. To separate them now wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a matter of what was right. But would anyone else see it that way? Would logic and policy win out over the unexplainable bond before her? The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned as Jake approached, his expression unreadable. He had been quieter than usual that morning, and Emma suspected he was just as conflicted about today's meeting as she was. He stopped beside her, following her gaze to the trio inside the enclosure. "They're sending a biologist and a rep from the state," he said finally, his voice low. "Should be here within the hour." Emma exhaled through her nose, resisting the urge to fold her arms. "And what's their stance?" Jake hesitated. "Officially, they want to assess Luna's progress. Unofficially, they're leaning toward release." Emma clenched her jaw. Of course they were. A rehabilitated bear belonged in the wild. That was the system. The problem was the system had never accounted for something like this. "Then we need to convince them otherwise." Jake glanced at her, his brows furrowing slightly. "You really think we can change their minds?" Emma turned back toward the glass, watching as Luna stirred again, shifting her enormous paw just enough to tuck Charlie closer. Willow, though still the smallest, was growing stronger by the day, and the way she pressed against Luna's thick fur told Emma that the tiny kitten saw the bear as her protector just as much as Charlie did. It wasn't instinct or coincidence. It was something deeper, something that no scientific theory could adequately explain. "We have to try," she said firmly. An hour later, the commission officials arrived. Dr. Miriam Carter, a wildlife biologist Emma had worked with in the past, stepped out of the vehicle first, adjusting her glasses as she took in the facility with sharp, assessing eyes. Beside her, Andrew Powell, a policy representative for the state's wildlife department, adjusted the cuffs of his thick coat before shaking hands with Mark, who had come out to greet them. Emma swallowed her frustration as she watched them exchange pleasantries. These were the people who held Luna's fate in their hands. Inside, they moved to the observation room, standing behind the glass as they assessed the bear's condition. Emma watched as Miriam took out a notepad, jotting down notes as she studied Luna's slow, relaxed breathing. "She looks good," she admitted after a moment. "Stronger, no signs of distress." "She's been eating regularly," Mark added. "Gaining weight again. Wound is healing well." Miriam nodded approvingly, but it was Powell who spoke next. "That's excellent news," he said. "So she should be ready for reintegration soon." Emma felt her pulse spike, but she kept her voice level. "That depends on how we define ready." Miriam glanced at her curiously. "You think she's not?" Emma shifted her stance. "I think this situation is more complicated than a standard rehabilitation case." She gestured toward the enclosure. "Luna isn't just recovering. She's bonded with those two." Powell arched an eyebrow. "The dog and the cat?" "Yes," Emma said firmly. "She's protecting them. That's not normal behavior for a grizzly. We have reason to believe that separating them could cause psychological distress, not just for Charlie and Willow, but for Luna herself." Miriam looked thoughtful but skeptical. "Emma, we've all seen animals form unusual bonds in captivity, but that doesn't mean they can't return to the wild. Luna is still a bear. She has instincts." Emma shook her head. "She had every opportunity to abandon them in the wild. She didn't. Even when she was injured, she stayed with them. That's not just instinct, that's choice." Powell frowned. "Regardless of the emotional aspect, Luna is a wild animal. She belongs in her natural habitat. And what happens if she tries to return for them?" Emma shot back. "What happens if she starts approaching human settlements because she's looking for the family she lost?" That gave them pause. Even Jake, standing slightly behind her, straightened at the unspoken implication. A bear seeking out human homes for companionship wouldn't just be unusual, it would be dangerous. Miriam exchanged a glance with Powell before sighing. "What exactly are you proposing?" Emma felt her heartbeat quicken. This was the moment. "We have the land, the resources. We could establish a sanctuary here, a controlled environment where Luna could live safely while still having access to the animals she's bonded with. We already house other rescued wildlife. Why not her?" Powell let out a quiet, disbelieving chuckle. "You're suggesting we keep a fully grown grizzly bear in permanent captivity just so she can stay with a dog and a cat?" "I'm suggesting we consider what's best for her," Emma countered. "And what's best for them?" Silence stretched between them. Miriam chewed the inside of her cheek, her notepad forgotten in her hands. "A sanctuary," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Powell, however, still looked unimpressed. "That's a logistical nightmare. You'd need funding, long-term planning, approval from multiple state departments." "We already have funding," Jake cut in unexpectedly. Emma turned to him in surprise, but he kept his gaze steady on Powell. "Ever since Luna's story went viral, donations have been pouring in, enough to start something real." Powell's expression tightened, clearly caught off guard. He looked to Miriam, who remained deep in thought. Finally, she exhaled and nodded slowly. "We'd need more data, more observation, but I'm not opposed to the idea." Emma barely managed to contain her relief. Powell sighed. "Fine, we'll hold off on releasing Luna, for now. But this isn't permanent. You'll have to prove that this sanctuary idea is viable." Emma met his gaze and nodded. "We will." As the officials left, she turned back toward the glass, watching as Charlie let out a small yawn and tucked himself closer against Luna's side. They had won the first battle, but the real fight was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with an exhausting mix of tension and determination. The temporary reprieve from the Wildlife Commission had bought them time, but time was not infinite. Emma knew that unless they could turn the idea of a sanctuary into something tangible, something undeniable, Luna's fate would still be up in the air. And if they lost that fight, if Luna was forced back into the wild alone, separated from Charlie and Willow, Emma had no doubt that they would all suffer. She had seen what separation did to animals that had formed deep bonds, the way some refused to eat, the way others searched relentlessly for what had been taken from them. It was a kind of grief that no scientific paper could fully capture. But Emma had witnessed it firsthand, and she wasn't about to let it happen here. She spent every spare moment gathering data, reviewing footage, documenting every behavior that proved Luna wasn't just tolerating Charlie and Willow, but had fully adopted them as part of her world. The evidence was compelling. The way she instinctively curled around them when they slept, the way she nudged food toward Charlie when he hesitated to eat, the way her eyes tracked Willow whenever the frail kitten wandered too far from the nest of blankets they had set up for her. But Emma knew data alone wouldn't be enough. They needed support. They needed people who would fight for this as fiercely as she and Jake were willing to. The first step was getting the public involved. Jake had already hinted at the viral attention Luna's story had received, but Emma had been too preoccupied with the immediate crisis to think about what that could mean. Now she realized it could mean everything. If people saw what she had seen, if they truly understood what was at stake, maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to tip the scales in their favor. She spent hours combing through the footage they had, carefully selecting the moments that spoke the loudest. The first time Charlie had curled against Luna's massive frame, the way Luna had hesitated, then shifted just enough to make room for him, the way Willow, still so small, had buried herself into the thick fur of the bear's paw, as though it was the safest place in the world. These weren't just clips of unusual behavior. They were proof. Proof that this bond wasn't just a fluke. Proof that what they were fighting for was real. Late one evening, she uploaded the video to the center's official page with a caption that read, "Some bonds defy explanation. A bear, a puppy, and a kitten. 3 lost souls who found each other. Now they need our help to stay together. Help us build them a sanctuary. Help us protect what nature created." She hit post and waited. The response was immediate. Within hours, the video had thousands of shares. People flooded the comments, some in disbelief, others in awe. News outlets reached out, eager for interviews, and soon the video was everywhere. Headlines popped up across major networks. A grizzly's gentle heart, the unbelievable bond that's captivating the world. Science can't explain it, but this bear is raising a puppy and a kitten. Donations skyrocketed. Messages poured in from people offering support, volunteering resources, even pledging land if it meant the sanctuary could become a reality. Emma barely had time to process it all before Mark called her into his office. He gestured toward his computer screen where the video played on loop. "Emma," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "do you have any idea what you just did?" Emma hesitated. You started a movement," he said. She swallowed hard. It was working. Over the next week, the center became the focus of global attention. Journalists arrived with cameras, eager to catch even a glimpse of Luna and her unusual family. Experts debated the science behind it, some calling it an anomaly, others calling it a phenomenon that challenged everything they thought they knew about interspecies relationships. But for Emma, none of the debates mattered. What mattered was that people cared. What mattered was that they saw what she saw. The Wildlife Commission was forced to take notice. The temporary hold on Luna's release was extended, and meetings were scheduled to discuss the feasibility of the sanctuary in earnest. It was a victory, but Emma knew better than to celebrate too soon. She had won battles before only to lose the war. One evening, as she stood outside Luna's enclosure, watching the bear breathe steadily, watching Charlie twitch in his sleep, and Willow's tiny body rising and falling against the thick fur of Luna's chest, she felt Jake step up beside her. "We've got momentum," he said. "We just have to make sure it lasts." Emma nodded. "I won't let them take her." Jake glanced at her. And if they decide against the sanctuary, Emma exhaled. Then we find another way. She didn't elaborate, but she meant every word. If the commission ruled against them, if they tried to force Luna back into the wild, Emma knew she wouldn't let it happen. She didn't know what she would do yet, only that she would do something. For now, she focused on what she could control. More videos, more documentation, more ways to show the world that what was happening inside this small rehabilitation center was more than just an oddity. It was proof that nature was more complex, more compassionate than they had ever imagined. The commission's final meeting was set for 1 week from today. That was all the time they had to prove that Luna's place wasn't back in the wilderness alone. It was here, with them, with Charlie and Willow. Emma had no intention of losing. The morning of the final decision arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that pressed against Emma's chest and refused to let go. The air outside the rehabilitation center was crisp, the Montana landscape dusted with a thin layer of frost, the last remnants of autumn clinging desperately before winter took hold. Inside, the tension was palpable. Staff members moved quietly, their glances filled with unspoken worry. This was it. Today, the commission would decide whether Luna would be released into the wild, forced to leave behind the 2 small creatures she had chosen to protect, or whether the sanctuary proposal would be approved, allowing them to stay together. The fate of an unexplainable family rested in the hands of people who might never fully understand what they were deciding. Emma stood outside Luna's enclosure, her fingers curled tightly around the observation railing as she watched the massive bear stir from her slumber. Charlie, ever the loyal shadow, was curled against Luna's side, his small black nose twitching as he dreamed. Willow was nestled just beneath Luna's chin, her tiny body nearly swallowed by the thick fur, her delicate paws kneading absently in her sleep. They didn't know what today meant. They didn't know that the life they had built together might be shattered before nightfall. Emma swallowed against the tightness in her throat. She had to win. The meeting was held in the center's conference room, a space that felt far too small for the weight of what was at stake. Dr. Miriam Carter sat at the head of the table, her usual composed demeanor unreadable, while Andrew Powell flipped through a thick folder of reports, his face drawn with something between skepticism and exhaustion. Mark sat to Emma's left, his hands folded in front of him, while Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression closed off but his presence steady, grounding. Other board members and officials filled the remaining seats, some whispering amongst themselves, others simply waiting. Miriam cleared her throat. "Let's begin." Powell adjusted his glasses, glancing at Emma. "You've made quite the case for Luna's continued stay here," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The public response has been overwhelming, to say the least. But we need to be clear that public sentiment alone does not dictate wildlife policy." Emma nodded, forcing herself to remain calm. "I understand that. That's why I've spent the past few weeks compiling scientific evidence that supports our proposal." She gestured to the thick binder in front of her. "Behavioral patterns, stress response levels, long-term impact projections. Luna's attachment to Charlie and Willow isn't just a novelty, it's an adaptation. If we release her now, we're not just sending her back into the wild, we're taking away the only family she has left." Powell sighed, flipping through the documents. "Emma, I won't deny that what's happening here is unique, but bears are solitary animals. Eventually, she'll revert to her natural instincts." Emma's jaw tightened. Her instincts are what led her to protect them in the first place. Miriam leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. "If we approve this sanctuary, we're setting a precedent. Others may argue that any bonded animal should be kept in captivity, even when release is possible." Emma met her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about captivity. It's about giving Luna an environment where she can thrive. If we force her into a situation where she feels unsafe, where she starts searching for what she's lost, she could end up wandering too close to human settlements. That would put her life at risk." Jake, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "She's been healing here for weeks, and not once has she shown aggression toward humans, even after everything she's been through. If she had, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But she's not dangerous. She's different." Miriam exhaled slowly. "The land you're proposing for the sanctuary, how much space?" Emma's heart skipped. They were considering it. We've secured 50 acres already through donations, enough for a controlled environment that mimics the conditions she would have in the wild. She would still have freedom, just without the risks. Powell exchanged a glance with Miriam. And the funding? Mark, who had been reviewing the financial reports all morning, pushed a folder toward them. With the money raised from public interest, private donors, and conservation grants, we have enough to sustain operations for at least 5 years. Miriam leaned back in her chair, staring down at the documents before her. The room was thick with silence. Then she spoke. I need a moment with the board. Emma's hands were trembling as she stepped outside, pacing the hallway while Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You did everything you could, he murmured. Emma shook her head. It's not enough until they say yes. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every possible outcome ran through Emma's mind, each one worse than the last. If they denied the proposal, if they took Luna away, if she had to watch Charlie and Willow lose the only mother they had ever known, she didn't think she could bear it. Finally, the door opened. Miriam and Powell stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Miriam cleared her throat. The board has reached a decision. Emma held her breath. The Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center is officially granted permission to establish the first designated sanctuary for non-traditional animal bonds. Luna stays. The relief hit Emma so hard she nearly staggered. She stays, Miriam nodded, her lips curving slightly. The public pressure helped, but ultimately your data was undeniable. This is something new, and we need to understand it. She belongs here. Emma let out a shaky breath, her entire body releasing the tension she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. Jake clapped a hand on her shoulder, murmuring, "Told you we'd pull it off." She barely heard him. She was already moving. The enclosure was quiet when she entered. Luna lay where she always did, her head resting on her massive paws, her eyes half-lidded in rest. Charlie lifted his head at the sound of Emma's footsteps, his tail wagging sleepily, while Willow stretched her tiny limbs, letting out a delicate yawn. Emma knelt down, pressing a hand gently to Luna's thick fur. The bear blinked at her slowly, something knowing in her deep brown eyes. "You're staying," Emma whispered, her throat tightening. "All of you, together." Luna exhaled, her massive body shifting as she stretched slightly, her paw brushing against Charlie in an instinctive gesture of protection. Emma sat with them for a long time, letting the reality settle. They had done it. They had changed the rules. And in doing so, they had proven something that no amount of science could fully explain. Some bonds, no matter how improbable, were simply meant to be. Some stories remind us that the world is full of mysteries beyond our understanding, and this is one of them. Luna's bond with Charlie and Willow defied everything we thought we knew about nature, proving that love and protection can transcend species, instincts, and expectations. It challenges us to rethink the way we see animals, not just as creatures driven by survival, but as beings capable of compassion, connection, and even family. This tale is more than just a remarkable rescue. It's a testament to the unbreakable bonds that can form in the most unexpected places. It reminds us that kindness exists in all forms, even in the wild, and that sometimes the strongest protectors come from the most unlikely guardians. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of resilience, hope, and the extraordinary connections that shape our world. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds us of the beauty hidden in the unexpected. See you in the next one.